Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. Fascist regimes in the 20th century did not simply disappear. They either crashed in flames, congealed into stagnant dictatorships, or slowly morphed into new forms, but almost all left behind mass death, broken institutions, and long shadows over whatever democracies came after. The arc of their rise and fall is not a comforting morality play so much as a set of hard warnings about how long violence, fear, and political myth can sustain a system, even after its ideology has been exposed as a lie. Start with the most familiar cases, the places where fascism got its original meaning. Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. Both regimes exploited the chaos that followed World War I, economic collapse, humiliation, and fear of socialism, to ride a wave of resentment into power, then set about dismantling pluralism, smashing independent unions and parties, militarizing public life, and building leader cults that conflated the person of the dictator with the destiny of the nation. They did not exit the stage because citizens calmly came to their senses. They were destroyed because they plunged the world into total war and were physically crushed by superior military coalitions after unleashing industrialized atrocity across Europe and beyond. Fascism in its most classical European form was not voted out. It was bombed out, occupied, put on trial, and in many cases literally hanged. That image of regimes that can only be removed by overwhelming external force shaped how later generations thought about authoritarianism, and also how future authoritarians learned to adapt to avoid obvious replay of the 1930s and 1940s. What came after those disasters was anything but a clean slate. In Italy, the post-Mussolini Republic had to construct a new democratic order on top of a society full of former collaborators, compromised elites, and institutions warped by 2 decades of one-party rule. The result was a fragile patronage-heavy party system dominated by a powerful Christian democratic center that quietly absorbed personnel and habits from the old regime, and a political culture in which the memory of fascism remained both a stigma and a recurring temptation. In West Germany, denazification was deliberately partial and uneven. Millions of people who had participated in, facilitated, or tacitly accepted a genocidal state were folded into a new constitutional order that had to preach never again while relying on the administrative and technical skills of people who had helped run the old one. The Federal Republic did become a model liberal democracy, but in significant part because it was constrained and supervised by Allied occupation, anchored in Western alliances, and because the horror of the Holocaust and total defeat made explicit fascism politically radioactive, even while more subtle and authoritarian reflexes and continuities lingered in courts, ministries, and corporate boardrooms. Outside the Axis core, regimes with fascist or quasi-fascist DNA followed a different timetable, not catastrophic defeat, but long endurance, slow decay, and late, often negotiated transitions. Estado Novo in Portugal is a textbook example, a corporatist, nationalist, clerical dictatorship that borrowed heavily from fascist imagery and methods, installed in the early 1930s and not dismantled until the mid-1970s. It survived World War II by declaring neutrality, aligned itself with the West in the Cold War, and justified its rule as a bulwark against communism, disorder, and moral decline. It did not fall to foreign invasion or a classic mass uprising, but to the Carnation Revolution of 1974, a military-led transition driven by war-weary officers and mounting public frustration, which opened a path to democracy while forcing Portugal to confront how decades of authoritarianism had stunted its economy, education system, and global standing. Franco's Spain offers an even starker illustration of how a regime infused with fascist elements can outlive fascism's formal defeat. Franco seized power through a brutal civil war fought with help from Hitler and Mussolini, borrowed the Phalange's fascist symbolism and rhetoric, and built a state grounded in militarism, Catholic integralism, nationalism, and systemic repression. Yet after 1945, as fascism became an epithet no government wanted attached to its name, the regime rebranded itself as a traditional authoritarian, anti-communist ally, gradually sidelining overtly fascist elements to secure diplomatic recognition and economic aid from the West. Franco did not die on a battlefield or in a bunker. He died in bed in 1975, and Spain's transition to democracy was orchestrated from above by reformist insiders around King Juan Carlos I and a cautious opposition that accepted broad amnesties in exchange for a peaceful path forward. The democratic miracle that followed, the 1977 elections, the 1978 Constitution, Spain's integration into Europe, rests on a foundation of unresolved memory, a democracy built not after a clean rupture, but after decades in which fear, censorship, and selective violence had become normal, and in which many perpetrators were never held to account. Japan, often grouped with the European fascist powers, followed a different but related trajectory. The imperial militarist system that led Japan into invasion, empire, and alliance with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy shared fascism and ultranationalism, its cult of sacrifice, and its contempt for liberal parliamentary politics, even if scholars still argue over whether it should be labeled fully fascist. Like Germany, it was smashed into total defeat. Cities incinerated, elites discredited, war crimes exposed, and a new constitution drafted under foreign occupation that renounced war and sharply constrained the military through Article 9. Yet the post-war settlement also preserved the emperor as a symbolic figure and integrated many pre-war economic and bureaucratic actors into a new order that combined pacifist constitutionalism with long-running conservative dominance. The result has been a democracy that is real but tightly managed, where the memory of militarist rule functions less as a daily political dividing line than as a submerged, sometimes contested moral baseline about the dangers of nationalism and unchecked executive power. Across these cases, the substantive legacy of 20th century fascism has been at least threefold. First, it permanently poisoned the brand. After Hitler and Mussolini, almost no major political movement willingly calls itself fascist, even when it imitates core techniques of leader worship, ethno-nationalism, and institutional sabotage. Second, it not normalize the idea that democracies can be killed from the inside through legal mechanisms, emergency decrees, manipulated elections, captured courts, politicized bureaucracies, long before tanks roll through city centers, leaving future authoritarians a playbook for doing in slow motion what fascists once attempted in open coups. Third, it left successor generations fighting over how much continuity there really was between the old regime and the new order. How far never again actually went when judges, police, administrators, media owners, and business elites often glided from dictatorship into democracy with little or no accountability. Fascism as a proud, self-conscious movement largely died in 1945, but many of its underlying impulses proved harder to bury. Hierarchy presented as order, xenophobia repackaged as security, and the personalization of power dressed up as the will of the people have repeatedly resurfaced in new guises, particularly during moments of crisis. The fascist states of the 20th century did not simply vanish, they decomposed into the soil of post-war politics, leaving behind institutions, habits, and myths that later leaders could till, rebrand, and weaponize without ever hanging the old name on the door again. Against that backdrop, Donald Trump looks less like an inexplicable anomaly in American politics and more like a new iteration of this longer fascist arc, adapted to a different medium in a different century. His great innovation has been to do, in the language of cable, hits, and social media posts, what 20th century fascists did with marches, rallies, and newsreels, construct a hyper-personalized politics in which loyalty to the leader trumps, no pun intended, loyalty to institutions, and in which reality itself is expected to bend to the needs of the movement. Where Mussolini promised to make the trains run on time, and Hitler promised national rebirth, Trump promises to restore a mythic America, purified of immigrants, critical journalists, independent prosecutors, and anyone else who declines to chant the slogans. The continuity is clear in his relationship to the law, violence, and the state. Classical fascists were explicit about discarding legality once power was secured. Trump has worked instead to hollow legality out from within, recasting the Justice Department, the immigration system, and the regulatory state as instruments whose real job is not to enforce neutral rules, but to protect friends and punish enemies. His embrace of law and order and Blue Lives Matter rhetoric sits uneasily beside his eagerness to sic law enforcement on political opponents and his willingness to bless more violence, above all on January 6, 2021, when it serves his purpose, a pattern that would have been instantly recognizable in Rome or Berlin circa 1933. Project 2025 and related blueprints for a second term are, in effect, the bureaucratic translation of the fascist impulse, diffuse party and state so thoroughly that civil servants, military officers, and judges cease to be guardians of a constitutional order and become foot soldiers in a leader's permanent campaign. The goal is not merely to govern, but to transform the machinery of the state into an extension of one man's political will, insulated as far as possible from electoral correction or legal constraint. At the same time, Trump exposes what is new about 21st century fascism, or what many scholars now call proto-fascism. He does not need a single mass party or a formal paramilitary militia when he has a radicalized national party apparatus, a sprawling ecosystem of media surrogates, and online networks capable of harassing, doxing, and intimidating opponents at scale. He does not need to ban opposition newspapers in a world where he can flood the zone with lies, conspiracies, and bad faith narratives until any shared sense of reality feels like a lost cause. And he does not need to cancel every election if he can so thoroughly delegitimize any result that does not go his way, and so thoroughly capture key levers of state power that the formal ritual of voting continues under a permanent threat of legal and extra-legal retribution. In that sense, he is both less and more than the fascist dictators of the last century. Less disciplined, less programmatic, more narcissistic and improvisational. But operating in a system whose guardrails he has already shown he can bend without quite breaking, and whose political, media, and economic elites have repeatedly chosen accommodation over genuine resistance. If the history of 20th century fascism teaches anything, it is that the line between this is ugly but temporary, and this is the new normal, is rarely crossed in a single dramatic moment. That line is crossed gradually, through accumulations of impunity, cycles of amnesty, strategic forgetting, and the quiet normalization of practices that would once have been unthinkable. West Germany's uneasy reliance on former Nazis, Portugal's long Estado Novo, Spain's pact of silence, Japan's managed democracy, all testify to how societies can move on without fully reckoning and how much of a dictatorship's culture can seep into the bones of whatever replaces it. Trump's movement is a live test of whether a wealthy, formally democratic state that has already seen what fascism did elsewhere will still let history rhyme, this time not with marching columns, matching uniforms, and radio addresses, but with executive orders, gerrymandered legislatures, algorithmic propaganda, and a leader who insists that the only legitimate country is the one reflected back in his own self-image. Trump's next frontier is rigging the 2026 congressional elections and complaining afterward about the result if he loses. The best way to stop this effort is in its tracks, and to begin the demise of this dictator is to vote in overwhelming numbers. Every vote counts, and we need every vote to undermine the Republican efforts to save themselves from electoral disaster. The future is in our hands, and when he has gone from the scene, there needs to be a reckoning. Trump has committed many crimes, and so have his lackeys. Let's hold them accountable in a manner that was foregone in past fascist regimes. This has been America's Fractured Politics. Thanks for taking the time to listen. If any of this resonated with you, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Until next time, this is Mark Mansour.